This is a brief overview of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, the three great literary prophets in our Tanakh, in our Hebrew Bible. The reason we say that they're great isn't a judgment on the quality of their work. It's that these three books are much longer than other books of the prophets. And so they're saying more. It doesn't make them more important necessarily, but it's important for us to be able to contextualize them, to be able to talk about their place in history, where they're coming from. They were very much products of their own time. They are speaking to their own generation. Now, we might say that they're speaking to us too, but we have to understand their message to us, their message to eternity, through the context of their message to their own generation. So you have to know the history, you have to know what was going on during that time. We spoke about some of that in our last class last week when we looked at the historical prophets. So just to give you the refresher, you've got the kingdom of David and Solomon, the united kingdom of Israel. And after Solomon's death, it splits into two: Israel in the north, Judah in the south. I'll pop up a map here so we can kind of go over the historical framework here. So you've got kingdom of Israel in the north, Judah in the south. Israel is much larger, it's much more prosperous, it's a better economic, better farming zone, that sort of thing. Judah is hillier and probably poorer and more isolated, is not on the major trade routes in quite the same way. What Judah has going for it is the capital, Jerusalem, and the family of David. So in Israel, there are many royal dynasties. One overthrows the last. There are periods of civil war, there are periods of uprising and rebellion, and no king sits safely and firmly on the throne. In Judah, it's not quite like that. The family of David reigns throughout the history of Judah, or at least the history that we have, the history that we're told. We have to sort of take these stories at face value because we don't have a lot of other sources about them. But it seems like there's much more dynastic stability in the South, but it is, other than that, it's sort of a backwater. There's not much happening there compared to what's going on in the north. So our prophets come from both places. Our prophets come from both countries, come from Israel, come from Judah, and in many cases they bounce back and forth between the two countries. And you'll see during this time period, Israel and Judah are often at war with their neighbors. Sometimes they're at war with each other. Sometimes they form an alliance. Israel and Damascus, they form an alliance and attack Judah. We're about to see that. And all of this is happening in the context of the growing power of the Assyrian Empire to the north, and of course, the long-lasting power of Egypt to the south. As Assyria grows more powerful, as Assyria becomes more of a rival against Egypt, this space in the middle is going to become the theater of their rivalry. This will be the battlefield between Assyria and Egypt. So we're gonna jump out of here and switch over to our text itself. We're gonna jump back into the book of Isaiah. So the prophecies of Isaiah, son of Amoz, who prophesied concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the reigns of, and these kings might sound familiar, Uzziah, Yotam, Achaz, and Chizkiah, the kings of Judah. So Uzziah, I guess you say in English, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. I never quite know how to pronounce them in English. And some of these names came up last week. This is getting toward the end of the period of the northern and southern kingdom, and Isaiah actually lives through the destruction of the northern kingdom and the near destruction of the southern kingdom in the time of Hezekiah. The king of Assyria invades Judah, largely destroys it, does not destroy Jerusalem, isn't able to break the siege, or succeed in the siege of Jerusalem. But this is a long time. These are many kings. No interest here in the north. The north isn't being discussed. You simply see the reigns of the southern kings. That gives you some sense of Isaiah's scope. Isaiah is interested in what's in the south, in Judah and Jerusalem. This is a little historical framework for this king, Uzziah. Says, this is from 2 Chronicles, then all the people of Judah took Uzziah, who was 16 years old, and proclaimed him king to succeed his father, Amaziah. It was he who rebuilt Elot and restored it to Judah. After King Amaziah slept with his fathers, Uzziah was 16 years old when he became king, and he reigned 52 years in Jerusalem. So a very long time he was king. And we have his mother's name here, Yekoliah of Jerusalem. Now, we don't have time to get into it, unfortunately. His father, Amaziah, really fascinating story. There's quite a difference, actually, between the book of Kings and the book of Chronicles in their description of this man, this king. He comes off pretty nicely in Kings and Chronicles. He is accused of idolatry. He is accused of defeating the Edomites, stealing their gods, taking their statues and bringing them back to Jerusalem. This was fairly common in the ancient world. When you defeated your enemies, you took their gods back with you. But then Amaziah worshipped the gods. He worshipped the Edomite gods, and for this he was struck down. So this is from the book of 2 Kings. Regarding Uzziah, he did what was pleasing to the Lord, just as his father Amaziah had done. So that's point of debate, actually. However, the shrines were not removed. The people continued to sacrifice and make offerings at the shrines. The bamot, the high places that the Deuteronomistic historian is very concerned about, worship sites other than Jerusalem. And Uzziah does not tear them down, but otherwise he's a pretty good king. He's a pretty good guy. So says the book of Kings. So, however, Chronicles goes into a little more detail and actually points to a serious situation. He made clever devices in Jerusalem set on the towers and the corners for shooting arrows and large stones. His fame spread far, for he was helped wonderfully and he became strong. When he was strong, he grew so arrogant that he acted corruptly. He trespassed against God by entering the temple of the Lord to offer incense on the incense altar. The priest Azariah follows him in. I'm paraphrasing here. Azariah yells at him, you shouldn't be doing this offering. The priest should be doing the offering. The Kohanim, get out of here. Uzziah doesn't get out and is struck with leprosy. Leprosy, this terrible ancient disease in which the body sort of falls apart slowly over the course of many years, and he is struck with leprosy immediately, sort of instantaneously, as a very clear sign of his transgression, that he went into the temple and he did something he shouldn't have been doing in the temple. And so they rush him out, because you don't want a leper in the temple. And then it says King Uzziah was a leper until the day of his death. He lived in isolated quarters as a leper. So 52 years he reigned, but most of the time, it would seem, his son was actually ruling the country in his place, because Uzziah was the king, but he was a leopard and he was set aside as a leopard, and his son Yotam ruled in his stead until eventually Uzziah died and his son Yotam became king in his own right. But he reigned for 52 years. So even though he was a leper, even though he was incapacitated, he served as king for an extraordinarily long time. So this, just one more thing here. So it says, in the 52nd year of King Azariah, that should say King Uzziah. It's an error, a scribal error. They mixed up Azariah the high priest and Uzziah the king. So this happens a little bit in the book of Kings. So in the 52nd year of King Azariah, should be Uzziah of Judah. So the king Pekah, son of Remaliah, becomes king over Israel and Samaria for 20 years. And then he ends up being the king when the Assyrians come in and begin dispersing the inhabitants. They begin exiling the inhabitants of Judah. They start here in this bit. King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria exiles the Transjordanian tribes, the tribes that live on the far side of the Jordan, and a little bit beyond also. And it's then, but the sort of the wheels are in motion. The northern kingdom will soon be destroyed. The exile has already started. So now we see, this is from Isaiah 6. So now we're getting into our prophet, our book of prophecy itself. Isaiah chapter 6, in the year that King Uzziah died, I beheld my Lord seated on a high and lofty throne, and the skirt of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs stood in attendance on him. Each of them had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his legs, and with 2 he could fly. And one would call to the other, Holy, 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 the Lord of hosts. His presence filled all the earth. So that's probably a pretty familiar text. If you don't know it in the English, you know it in the Hebrew. Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzvaot, Melocho la'aretz kivodo. We say it a few times during the morning service. We say it in the Kedusha, in the Amidah. When we do the repetition of the Amidah, we are sort of channeling the angels in heaven, and we're imitating the angels in a sense. And this is one of those moments we go on tiptoes as we say this. So probably what Isaiah is seeing here or hearing here isn't a bunch of angels saying, holy, holy, holy. Probably the angels are saying, holy. That's what they're saying, but there are so many of them that it seems to echo. So it's, holy, 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 and it's just a cacophony. And so what Isaiah is trying to write here is this sort of echoing, never-ending chant of the holiness of God. And there's a lot going on here. There's a lot to unpack. I wish we had more time to get into it. For our purposes, for understanding the historical context, it's important to note right back here on the first verse, this is the year that King Uzziah died. So the king has died. The new king has taken his place. His son and longtime regent has taken his place. And we go back up here, and this is the same year. Remember, he reigned for 52 years. So in the same year, the new king takes over in Israel, and he will be the king who presides over the beginning of the end, the destruction of the northern kingdom. So this is a very momentous year. New king in Judah, new king in Israel, Assyrians sort of waiting in the wings. Remember what it was that the king of Judah had done that was so bad, is he went into the temple and he did something he shouldn't. He saw something he shouldn't. He exceeded the boundaries of what was legal and appropriate in the sacrificial system, in the temple system, and he suffered for it. He suffered a terrible consequence. And it would seem that maybe Isaiah is worried about the same thing happening to him, because we see here in verse 4, the doorpost would shake at the sound of the one who called, and the house kept filling with smoke. And I cried, woe is me, for I am lost. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my own eyes have beheld the King, Lord of hosts. So Isaiah is very worried that he has transgressed, that he's done something he shouldn't have done, and perhaps he has Uzziah in mind. Perhaps he is thinking about what happened to Uzziah, and he does not want that to happen to him. He doesn't want to become a leper. He's, seeking forgiveness for perhaps accidentally transgressing a boundary, because this is not something that normally happens when you're in the temple. You're in the temple. There's plenty of ceremony, plenty of pomp and circumstance, and there's a magic to the whole thing. But you don't get to see behind the curtain all that often. You don't get to see what's going on. You don't get to see this echo of a heavenly Jerusalem, a heavenly temple. But now we're seeing that Isaiah is being given he's being given a new set of glasses, and now he can see what normally people can't see. And one of the things he's able to see is behind the scenes of the temple in Jerusalem. There is something paralleling it. There is something that in heaven that is sort of stands in. Perhaps the Jerusalem temple is like a microcosm of the heavenly temple and of the heavenly realm in general. And Isaiah was not expecting this that day. This wasn't how he thought his day was going to go, and now he's terrified. And so one of the seraphim flies over to him with a live coal from the altar and touches it to his lips and says, "Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt shall depart and your sin shall be purged away." And then it says, "Then I heard a voice of my Lord saying, 'Whom shall I send? Who will go for us?' And I said, 'Here I am, send me.' And he said, 'Go, say to that people, hear indeed, but do not understand, see indeed, but do not grasp.'" So Isaiah is being given his mandate to speak to the Jewish people. And we see, he says, "How long, my Lord?" And he replied, "Till towns lie waste without inhabitants, and houses without people, and the ground lies waste and desolate. For the Lord will banish the population, and deserted sites are many in the midst of the land." So we haven't quite gotten here yet, but we're about to. It's only a few years away, but Isaiah is already seeing that the exile is in Israel's future, is in the Jewish people's future. But Isaiah, not only is he seeing a prophecy of the exile, he's seeing a prophecy of what comes after, that there is a future beyond the destruction. There's a future beyond the exile in verse 13. "But while a tenth part yet remains in it, it shall repent, it shall be ravaged like the terebinth and the oak, of which the stumps are left even when they are felled. Its stump shall be a holy seed." So there is a seed planted for the future. There will be a restoration even after this terrible destruction that the north and the south are very much on the verge of. And so now this is a big text. We're not going to look at all of this here, but we see. So this is his son who had been reigning on his behalf, had been the regent on his behalf. Now his son is going to be a king in his own name. It says Ahaz was 20 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 16 years. He did not do what was pleasing to the Lord, as his ancestor David had done, but followed the ways of the kings of Israel. He even consigned his son to the fire, in the abhorrent fashion of the nations which the Lord dispossessed before the Israelites. He made sacrifices and offerings at the shrines on the hills and under every leafy tree. So, not a good king. Not a good king or a good Jew.
If he was a regent, why wasn't Uzziah allowed to reign? Why wasn't he given full rights?
So because he was a leper. So he went into the temple. He did something he shouldn't have done in the temple, and his punishment from God was that he became leprous. And he was a king, but like all lepers of the time, he was a social outcast, and he was not allowed to mix with general society. or even be buried with the rest of his ancestors. When he died, he was buried in a separate grave site, probably presumably because he was a leper. And it's we don't have any details about what was happening to him physically during that time, but we know from ancient accounts that the body begins sort of slowly decaying, falling apart. It's very unpleasant experience, and not the sort of thing that you could do at the same time you were reigning as king. So it's I mean, in other circumstances, in other countries, probably he would have been overthrown. They wouldn't have allowed him to be king in the first place, because part of being a king was to lead the country in war, to lead the country in battle, and you can't do that when you're dealing with this terrible disease. But now we see his son takes over, and not such a great guy. And then we see King Rezin of Aram and the king of Israel. They advance on Jerusalem for battle. And so Ahaz sends messengers to the king of Assyria saying, "Deliver me from Aram." And he takes the gold and silver from the temple in Jerusalem, and he gives them as a gift to the king of Assyria. And the king of Assyria takes this bribe and marches against Damascus. And so, from this point of view, from this text, from the second king point of view, this is this is sort of like opening the newspaper and seeing what's going on. They're the Israel and Damascus. They marched against Judah, and it probably seemed like an easy victory. They were much stronger than Judah. But Judah had a trick up their sleeve, which is that they gave money to an even bigger country to attack on their behalf. So this is just, alliances and secret treaties and the great game, and, very like sort of Otto von Bismarck style politics. And that's the perspective we're being given here. Isaiah tells us the same story, but as a different point of view, very different perspective. So we see, again, we're just going to skim some of this. So in the reign of Ahaz, we have they come to Jerusalem to attack it. They're not able to. The hearts of the people trembled as trees of the forest sway before the wind. But God speaks to Isaiah, says, "Go talk to the king and tell him, be firm and be calm, do not be afraid, and do not lose heart." And so and then we see God continues, they'll march against Jerusalem, but they won't succeed. And so presumably Isaiah does this. He goes and talks to the king, which shows you the sort of position he's in. That he's in a place where he can just go talk to the king. Gives some credence to the idea that he's part of the royal family. But then it says, "The Lord spoke further to Ahaz, ask for a sign from the Lord your God, anywhere down to Sheol or up to the sky." But Ahaz replied, "I will not ask. I will not test the Lord," which is a very pious thing to say. And it makes it a little strange that a man who has been worshiping pagan gods and sacrificing children is now suddenly so pious that he won't even ask God for a favor. I don't know. There's probably more to the story. There's probably more to it that's been lost to us. But Isaiah replies, "Listen, house of David, is it not enough for you to treat men as helpless that you also treat my God as helpless? So ask. You've got to ask. There's no harm in asking God. The worst that's going to happen is he's going to say no, but you got to ask." But he says, "Assuredly, my Lord will give you a sign of his own accord." So if you're not going to ask for a sign, God's going to give you one anyway. It says, "Look, this young woman is with child and about to give birth to a son. Let her name him Emmanuel," which means God is with us. "By the time he learns to reject bad and choose good, people will be feeding on curds and honey." So they're under siege right now. They're hungry, they're starving, but there's a baby that's about to be born. This woman over here is pregnant. Probably Isaiah is talking about his wife or maybe the king's wife. Those are kind of the two options that people present. So someone is pregnant, and when by the time this baby knows the difference between good and bad, people are going to be eating really sweet, tasty, decadent food, not the sort of food that starving people eat, not the sort of food you eat when you're under siege. Because the Lord will cause to come upon you and your people and your ancestral house such days as have never come since Ephraim turned away from Judah, that self-same king of Assyria. So now Isaiah is sort of putting his own spin on this. Like, yes, the Assyrians are the proximate cause of what's of Judah's and Jerusalem's rescue here. But the real cause is God. God is the one behind the scenes. God is the one making all of this happen. Now, I bring this passage because it's so emblematic of Isaiah. It's such and it's a great story too. It's also, some of you might recognize this. This is a famously misquoted chapter, where it says, "Look, the young woman is with child and about to give birth to a son." The Greek word for young woman is parthenos, which can also mean virgin. And that got a lot of people's attention, that a virgin was about to give birth to a son. And you know the rest of the story. But the Hebrew is quite specific, that it's just a woman. It's just a young woman, nothing all that interesting. The sign isn't the woman having a baby. The sign is that by the time the baby is old enough to know the difference between good and bad, we're all going to be eating again, and we're all going to have tasty food. All right, so then we have, in the 12th year of King Ahaz of Judah, Hoshea, the son of Elah, becomes king over Samaria for 9 years. He did what was displeasing to the Lord, and King Shalmaneser marches against him, and he becomes a vassal. But he wasn't a very good vassal, apparently. He secretly formed a treaty with the king of Egypt to rebel against the Assyrians. And so the king of Assyria comes and imprisons him, and they destroy the whole land. It says they came to Samaria, besieged it for 3 years. It's a little unclear whether this is King Shalmaneser or whether it's King Sargon of Assyria, but it's one or the other, or probably both. Probably there was Sargon, Shalmaneser's son, and so he takes over in the middle of this siege, in the middle of this 3-year period. And you see here, this is a complete annihilation that's being described here. All of the people get captured, and they are deported, and they're taken to the other side of the Assyrian Empire. And the text goes on to say that the people from Israel are taken over here, and people from over here are taken to Israel, and everyone's all sort of mixed together, and we have sort of a melting pot by force. And this was the Assyrian approach. And it was incredibly successful. They did it because it worked. They did it because by mixing people together, by removing people from their ancestral lands, by getting people to marry other kinds of people, eventually your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren forget anything other than that they're Assyrians. They might have some vague memory. Oh yeah, my great-grandmother came from Israel, but that's all it is. It's just a vague memory. And this sort of policy of exile and assimilation was very useful. It was very successful. And what our 3 prophets are going to sort of stake the Jewish people's future on is that we can survive that. We can survive being sent to another country, being in an unfamiliar place with unfamiliar people and food and gods and customs, and that through it all, things might change, we might change, but we will continue to be loyal to God and loyal to our people. And it was a gamble, and I suppose in a sense it still is. but this was the Judaism that they made. They said, we're leaving behind land, we're leaving behind the temple, we're leaving behind familiar places, but what's going to happen next is we can still hang on to some things, and what we can hang on to is God and our people and our history and our covenant. All right. Any questions about that before we pop over to Jeremiah?
Is that the annihilation of the entire northern kingdom at that point in time?
Yes.
And
so
when
that
was
happens. What's that?
When? You were just about to say when that was.
Oh yeah, so this is in the time of Isaiah. So this is when Isaiah is doing his thing, and in the time of King Ahaz of Judah. And there the king up north is named Hoshea, and this is what's described in Isaiah chapter 1. These books are usually understood to be out of order. They're not in chronological order. So by the time when you get to Isaiah chapter 1, this is sort of in the middle of the story, and it's describing the absolute annihilation of what's going on in the north. It could be also, and this is just sort of to bridge our two subjects, our two prophets here. When Ahaz dies, his son takes over, and his name is Hezekiah, Chizkiyahu, and he's one of the good ones. He's one of the few kings that is known to be really good. He tears down those high places that the author of Kings has been so upset about. He finally gets rid of the high places, and he also survives a siege. I spoke about this a little bit last week. Sennacherib, or Sancherib in Hebrew, is the king of Assyria, and he comes to invade Judah, and he destroys all of it except for Jerusalem. And we have the Bible's version of the story. We have his version of the story, discovered by archaeologists in the 19th century. They don't exactly line up, but you can sort of read between the lines. There's a great book on this subject by Baruch Halpern at the University of Toronto. He's written extensively on, this is propaganda and that's propaganda, but if you sort of look at where do they line up implicitly, or where do they not contradict each other, you can see, oh, okay, so God sent a plague and spared the city of Jerusalem, whereas Sancherib says, Jerusalem was walled up like a bird in a cage, is how he says it. And like, yes, okay, so you can find the story in the middle there, where you destroyed everything except Jerusalem, and then you went home.
And this was, of course, before the Babylonian destruction.
Yes. So this is the Assyrians, and Sancherib sort of is at the height of the Assyrian Empire. Things are going to go downhill from here. We may talk about this next week. I haven't decided yet. There's so much to cover next week, where we do 12 prophets instead of 3. And so the prophet Nahum talks about the fall of Assyria. Everyone knows Jonah. Everyone knows Jonah from Yom Kippur. And Assyria is spared, and Jonah is kind of sad about it. If you keep reading, the next prophet, Nahum, talks about the destruction of Assyria. And Assyriologists are convinced that he knows Assyria really well, because he uses expressions in Hebrew that are a little strange, but if you translate them into the Assyrian language, Akkadian, they actually make a lot of sense. And so anyway, that's for next week. But Assyria falls, and the new kid on the block is Babylonia. The Babylonians sort of rise, and they take over the Assyrian Empire, and they continue a number of these practices, including, probably most importantly for our conversation, the practice of exile continues by the Babylonians. But the sort of interlude between them is a time where things go pretty well. So this is the sort of rise of Hezekiah. Many people point to the time of Hezekiah as probably the time when some of the earliest strata of the Torah are being solidified. Of course, this is not the traditional point of view that it was written by Moses. This is more of the scholarly point of view that it's written a few centuries later. This is the time. This is when you have J and E doing their thing, and it matches Hezekiah's attempt to turn Judah into a restored, united Israel. The northern kingdom has been destroyed by the Assyrians, but now they're maybe on the way out too. And so Hezekiah has ambitions to move north. Now, the story goes in the Talmud that Hezekiah didn't have any children, and when his he suffers a terrible disease, and it seems like he's about to die. This is in the book of Isaiah. So he suffers this disease. It seems like he's about to die, and he prays to God, and God gives him an extra 15 years. And in that 15 years, according to the Talmud, he marries Isaiah's daughter, and they have a baby who is this guy is a doozy. So I want to I don't want to tell you something that's not true. I want to make sure I've got this right. So yeah, so it's Hezekiah has a son named Menashe, and Menashe is a truly terrible king, apparently, and like the worst one of the worst human beings who ever lived, according to the tradition. Very much not in his father's in his father's mold, or his grandfather. If you take the story that he's Isaiah's grandson, I mean, this guy, he sacrifices his son to Molech, and he restores the high places that his father had torn down. And then he has a son named Ammon, who only reigns for a couple of years, and he is in the end he is himself assassinated, and that brings us to his son Josiah. So this is Hezekiah's great grandson, and Josiah, he is thought to be the redeemer. He's thought to be the one who's going to make everything better. He's going to make everything all right. He continues his great grandfather's reforms, tears down the high places once again, and that brings us into the story of Jeremiah. So I'll pull the text back up here. So now we're, the Babylonians are ascendant. The northern kingdom has been destroyed now for a while. Southern kingdom's doing all right. We have the words of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, one of the priests of Anatot in the territory of Benjamin. I could teach a whole class on this first line. We don't have time, but there's so much cool stuff here. And so this seems like just like someone slapped this on later. By the way, you've probably been in Jerusalem to the Shrine of the Book at the Israel Museum, where they keep the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you've probably seen the Isaiah scroll. It's so cool. The one they show you isn't actually the Isaiah scroll. I don't want to burst anyone's bubble, but it's a fake. It's a copy. The real Isaiah scroll, they don't leave it out for you to look at. The other scrolls are real. The other scrolls are real, but the Isaiah scroll, that's a fake. So a lot of people know Isaiah, the version of Isaiah found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, is virtually identical to our copy of Isaiah, which is really cool. I mean, before we found the Dead Sea Scroll copy, our next earliest one was 1,000 years later. So finding this copy really helps us to understand the history of this text. But people who like kind of go wild about the Isaiah scroll, they spend a lot less time focusing on the Jeremiah scrolls, and there's a good reason for that, which is the Jeremiah stuff from the Dead Sea Scrolls is all over the place. It's completely out of order, or I should say it's in a completely different order, and there's no real consistency to it, and it seems like Jeremiah came together as a book later than Isaiah did. which would make a certain amount of sense. I mean, it is a newer book. But what we have, so this first line here probably got slapped on towards the end of the composition, and this was the actual first line. The word of the Lord came to him in the days of King Josiah, the son of Ammon in Judah, the 13th year of his reign. And so we have this beautiful little bit where Jeremiah is concerned that he's not really qualified to be a prophet because he's very young. And God essentially comforts him by saying, you know, I chose you to be a prophet before you were even born. So don't tell me about too young. I'm not interested in that. You've got a job to do. By the way, other people, you may encounter this if you drive down the highway. Other people love this verse as a sort of polemic against abortion. It's very much not the meaning of the text, and that would be a whole other conversation. But it is a misreading of the text to make this about some sort of proof that life begins at conception or something like that. It's just not there. We'll save that conversation for another day, but I just wanted to mention while we're looking at it, it's not there. All right, so we have the same sort of thing as in Isaiah. The Lord put out his hand and touched my mouth, and said to me, herewith I put my words into your mouth. And so Jeremiah is appointed to be a prophet, and we're given the sort of the term of his commission. I appoint you this day over nations and kingdoms to uproot and pull down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. Now that's probably the end, but I wanted to bring this next little bit here, just so you see what we're doing here. The word of the Lord came to me. What do you see, Jeremiah? I replied, I see a branch of an almond tree. The Lord said to me, you have seen right, for I am watchful to bring my word to pass. Makes no sense in English, but if we go back to the Hebrew, we see Vayamar makel shaked ani ro'eh. So I see the almond, the shaked, and God says, Vayomer Adonai Elai teveni lirot ki shoked ani al devarai lasoto, because I am shoked to do my word. So that's the pun they're making here, like watchful. Watchful is a pretty good translation. Jeremiah loves these sort of puns. There's a bunch of these in Jeremiah. It's cute, it's clever, I guess, but it also, you know, if you sort of love the texture of the Hebrew language, you can pick up a lot of fun stuff in Jeremiah.
No thanks.
All right, so we'll keep going here. I pulled this out of context just so you can see what Jeremiah is doing here. It says, the word of the Lord came to me as follows: if a man divorces his wife and leaves him and marries another man, can he ever go back to her? Would not such a land be defiled? So he's bringing a very specific case here. If you divorce and the wife remarries, and then she divorces again, you can't remarry her. And he's bringing this as an analogy to Israel, that Israel has been fooling around with other gods. And you might imagine that according to the Torah, once you have defiled yourself with the other gods, you can't go back to your husband. You can't go back. But he says, no, that's not the case. God is actually more forgiving than the law of the Torah here. Now, the reason I bring this up is that this is a very specific case, probably not something that happened all that often, that you marry and you divorce, and you marry someone else and you divorce, and then you go back to your first husband. I don't know, maybe in small towns or something it might have happened from time to time, but it's a very specific case, and it's from the book of Deuteronomy. And so Jeremiah here is very specific, that Jeremiah is quoting the book of Deuteronomy. This is what leads Richard Elliott Friedman to think that Jeremiah is the author of Deuteronomy. I'm not sure I'm willing to go quite that far. But we see in Jeremiah, more than in Isaiah, we see very direct quotes from the Torah. Isaiah is a little shy to quote Torah. Is the pious way to say it. He might not have had a copy of it. Is another pious way to say it. But Jeremiah quotes Torah. He quotes it here in last week's Haftarah, this past Saturday. He specifically quotes the bit from Parshat Mishpatim about freeing slaves, as he's yelling at everyone. So Jeremiah is he is familiar with other layers of text, yeah, in a way that Isaiah seems maybe not to be. All right, we'll keep going here. Says, and the Lord said to me, rebel Israel has shown herself more right than faithless Judah. It's a little unclear what that means. Rashi says it's because Israel didn't know any better. The northern kingdom didn't know that exile was on the table. But now that the people in the southern kingdom have seen what can happen, they ought to straighten up, but they don't for some reason. And so they're even worse because they should have seen what happened. It says, only recognize your sin, for you have transgressed against the Lord your God and scattered your favor among strangers under every leafy tree. You have not heeded me. So this is another reference to that foreign worship, the worship of other gods. And so we see that Jeremiah is very concerned about the worship of other gods. But he speaks not only about a coming destruction, but of a sort of a blessed time beyond it. He says, men shall no longer speak of the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, nor shall it come to mind. Elsewhere, he says there's a coming redemption that will be so much greater than the Exodus from Egypt that no one's ever even going to talk about the Exodus anymore. Because why would they even talk about the Exodus when they could talk about the redemption coming from the north? And so he's very clear that the story continues. There is a coming exile that seems inevitable, but it's not going to be the end of the story. This is one of my favorite bits right here. So he said Jeremiah stands at the temple gate, and he yells at everyone who's coming in. Mend your ways and your actions. I'll let you dwell in this place. Do not trust in your illusions and say, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord are these. So what he's driving at here is don't imagine that you're safe because you got God's house here. God lives here. Nothing bad can happen to us because nothing bad can happen to God. No, he says, if you want to mend your ways and your actions, execute justice between one man and another. Do not oppress the stranger, the orphan, the widow. Don't shed the blood of the innocent in this place, and don't follow other gods. Only then will I let you dwell in this place, in the land that I gave to your fathers for all time. So Jeremiah is very unpopular because a lot of people like to lean on a certain set of self-assurance, perhaps born by the fact that the Assyrians weren't able to destroy Jerusalem. They destroyed everything else, but they couldn't destroy Jerusalem. And don't we have the God's house just down the street? And don't we have a promise from God to live in this land? And don't we have the family of David that's supposed to rule forever? Nothing bad could ever happen to us. We have all these assurances from God. And Jeremiah is saying, no, that's not how it works. You have the assurances from God if you do justice, if you build a just world for the poor, for the stranger, for the orphan, then you will have the blessings of God. But if you don't do those things, it doesn't matter that you live next to God's house. It's really not going to protect you. This made him enormously unpopular. He was the only prophet to speak this way, really. He's known to be especially unpopular and to have a minority opinion. Most of the prophets, or so-called prophets, are saying, oh yeah, everything's fine, don't worry about it. There's a reason we don't talk about those people anymore, is that Jeremiah turned out to be right. He was completely correct. that the Babylonians were coming and they were going to destroy the
Was,
southern kingdom.
excuse me,
Please, Joanne.
was there a northern kingdom at that point in time that he's referring to, or is that euphemistic?
It's historical. He's talking about, the kingdom of Israel it was in people's memory. The Book of Kings says there were a number of refugees who came down from the northern kingdom to the southern kingdom. So people sort of knew about it. All right, these next little bits I brought here, we really don't have time to get into them, unfortunately, but I just wanted to show you the destruction of the southern kingdom happens in stages. So the king becomes a vassal of the Babylonians, and then he rebels, and the Babylonians invade, and then they send a few people into exile, and then they put a new king on the throne, and he rebels, and they invade. And a few more people are sent into exile. And then finally, you have the big final rebellion where the city is destroyed and everyone is sent into exile. And that'll be relevant for our conversation. I just wanted you to see it happen. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in stages. And we have Jeremiah has a word to the people who have been sent into exile. He sends a message to Babylonia. He says, build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their fruit, take wives and beget sons and daughters. Multiply there, do not decrease, and seek the welfare of the city to which I have exiled you, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its prosperity you shall prosper. So this is Jeremiah essentially establishing the diaspora as a concept. This is you're going to live as Jews, but you're not going to live in the land of Israel. You're going to live somewhere else, and you need to really live there. You need to take care of yourself, take care of your family. It's not an act of disloyalty to build a garden. You might imagine someone saying, you can't build a garden because we're going to be whisked back to Jerusalem any day now, and that house you built is an affront to God because we're going back any day now. And Jeremiah says, no, you got to live your life. Yes, you're going to go back, but for now you got to live your life. And not only do you have to live your life, you have to take care of the place where you live. You have to watch out for the city, watch out for your neighbors, be a good citizen. I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically what's going on here. And then he specifies that this is going to last for 70 years. And then at the end of the 70 years, I'll gather you from the nations and I'll bring you back to the place from which I have exiled you. And this is probably the other reason why Jeremiah's writings are preserved, is that he was right. It was 70 years, almost on the dot. It's really quite striking how it works out. In 70 years, the Babylonians give way to the Persians, and the Persians say you can go back and you can rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. So that's Jeremiah. I want to show Ezekiel. We really don't have time, unfortunately, for Ezekiel. But I'll just point out here that Ezekiel is sent into exile in one of those middle exiles. It's not the big exile. Ezekiel is actually established in the land of Babylon sooner than most of the Jews. And while he's there, he gets a vision of God. Also, he gets the vision of this is also quoted in our tefillah in the Amidah, where we say Baruch Kavod Adonai Mimkomo. And this is the second bit of the Kedusha, along with Isaiah 6, which is the first. And the Ezekiel vision is very weird. It's very weird. I have my own theory about what the wheels within wheels are in the angelic vision, and we don't have time to get into it, which is too bad because I'm completely right, but I can't find anyone else who agrees with me about it. But that happens sometimes. It's okay. You got to know a little astronomy to know about this. All right. This is the
To
bit that
us.
people. What's that?
Send it to us. I
Another time. Yes, absolutely.
or either make it a special. When is it read? You know.
Uh, oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I should double check.
Yeah.
Um, All right, this is the bit I want to bring. A lot of people know the vision of dry bones. Then maybe if you get into Jewish apocalypticism, you know Ezekiel 38, the war of Gog and Magog. We read that on Shmini Atzeret Haftarah, if I remember correctly. And then it gets a little more boring because then Ezekiel spends 9 chapters talking about what the temple is going to look like when it gets rebuilt. And if you're like really into that sort of thing, it's very interesting. But most people aren't really into it. And so the book sort of drags at the end. But it is an incredibly detailed blueprint of what the restored temple is going to look like when it gets rebuilt. I brought just a little bit of it here. But this goes on for 9 chapters and it's incredibly detailed. And what we know from the Second Temple period is that this blueprint wasn't really followed especially well, which leads a lot of people to think, oh, this is the vision for the Third Temple. This is Second Temple is sort of like a little parentheses, but the Third Temple is the one that's really going to last forever. And then I want to bring just one more little nugget here. So Ezekiel is very insistent that when the temple is restored and rebuilt, that only people from the family of Tzadok will be allowed to be priests. And that's the family of Tzadok. You might know this word. It gets sort of translated and butchered into Greek and becomes Sadducees. The Sadducees were one of the parties of Jews described by Josephus, and they were in charge of the temple. But the family of Tzadok actually isn't in charge of the temple, the Second Temple, for very long, because when the Maccabees take over, they are not from the family of Tzadok. The Hashmonaim, they are from another line of priests, and they're the ones who end up with the position of high priest for most of the time of the Second Temple. So Ezekiel, he had a vision of something. You could say he was wrong, or you could say that it just wasn't a vision of the Second Temple. That this is a vision for what's going to come later.